In the following pictures, I'm going to show you, the students, some examples of real student work where some mistakes were made. I'm going to try and point them out to you and give you some simple tips if I can. Here's a tip. Make sure your trim is all the same width and the same thickness before you use the miter saw and try and miter the top. On the nightstand, you need to round over the bottom of the top trim. On the stile and rail, make sure the rail, that bottom rail, covers that plywood edge there, so you don't have that exposed plywood lip right there. You can't do anything about it. You can't sand the plywood because you'll burn through the veneer. On the rail here, you can see that the rail is not 90 degrees. It's not a gapless seam, and that's what you're after. The student didn't check the miter saw to make sure it was 90, or they didn't check it before they glued it on. Here you have an open miter joint, which is not good. Simply dry fitted. They should have taken a little bit more time to make sure it was precise before they glued and nailed it on. The sides, they have a gap. The stile to the right, that gap is probably caused by the student getting too heavy-handed on the corner with a random orbital, and the proper clamping technique would have alleviated the one on the left. This here is just an example of really bad craftsmanship. Probably the student was impatient, did not round over the bottom trim, and did not use the proper technique when mitering. Here, the student didn't use proper technique when labeling the sides and put a rabbet on the very front of the nightstand when the rabbet belongs in the back to accommodate the plywood back when we're done. Poor clamping pressure was the cause of this open gap, which means that the back is probably narrower than the front, which means that the whole nightstand is probably going to be out of square. Make sure that you don't have any gaps. And this glue up here, the student glued stiles and rails together but did not drive the screws all the way tight. Thus, you have gaps between the end of the rails and the side of the stiles. This student, the same face frame in the previous slide, the student didn't pre-mill all the parts to make sure they're the same thickness. This is about 20-25 minutes of sanding with a random orbital sander. In this picture, you can see that the face frame is too thick for the overhang of the top. The student did not dry fit to see that he or she needed to sand this down more through a wide belt before gluing it on. And here the bottom shelf is inset too far. Thus, when the student puts on the face frame, glues and nails it on, it's going to end up with a gap at the bottom that you can't do anything about. So it will look like poor craftsmanship. And here's a better look at that gap. It's about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, and that's a big gap when you're furniture making. In this picture here, I thought it was a really neat picture because it actually shows you the hollow tubes of ingrain. This is an example of where a student did not flush out the back to the side of a hope chest. Just bad decision when gluing up. Not a bad job. The only thing I could recommend in this particular photo is that the student could have used more clamping pressure along the bottom rail there, the trim, so that you didn't have that gap right there in the front. Most times students will make their case for their nightstand, think that everything is good. Always dry fit, double check your measurements, and here's why. You think it looks good, but it's not. The top is 18, the bottom is 17 3/4. Always dry fit. That means that you will have an out of square nightstand, which is a very, very difficult task to work with the rest of the project. Nail holes too high. I can't tell you guys enough to make sure that the nail holes are towards the center, so then when you route the top edge that you don't route through them. Miter joint. It's open, it's bad. Doesn't show discipline in taking your time. There's glue that's here. There's no excuse for this. Glue rags and a sharp stick in 5 minutes and you wouldn't have the running glue down the side of your nightstand. Stile is not wide enough to cover the edge of the the plywood, or the rails are too short. This is done by dry fitting. Once again, if it's not wide enough, you should have fixed it. Always measure and add 1/8. This is an example of a nightstand on how you can attach a solid wood top to a nightstand using plywood stretchers. But when the student made the face frame, no less, they made it too long and they had to go and cut the top off, almost cutting through the pocket screw itself and ruining one of my saws. This is just because they used bad measurements. Here you have an overhang. This is the overhang, and you should have it on the top so the face frame can go underneath and be flush to the front edge of the top. This is a coffee table leg that the student left glue on when they screwed the aprons to the leg. This is not an easy thing to do to sand off. It's a lot easier to make sure that all the legs have the glue removed out. Also, there was a defect in the leg joint that needed to be taken care of, and there was excess glue squeeze out on the apron when it was screwed into the leg. These need to be wiped away while the glue is still wet. Here you can see the student had a bad miter joint glue up. The details on the cove and bead are not even the same. You have gaps along the side and along the front as well. This is just poor craftsmanship, poor attention to detail. Again, we have glue squeeze out on the bottom. We have a bad alignment on a miter, and we have trim that's not rounded over, nor is it the same width. These are things that tells me that the student was in a hurry or just didn't care. Nail hole too high, a chip in the top veneer. Make sure you take care of these nightstands while they're being stored from a day-to-day usage so that you don't chip that veneer. You have gaps along the top edge where the trim is meeting the plywood top. You got to take care of these tops, otherwise you end up with these enormous gaps. Here you can see the student didn't use proper clamping technique to make sure there's no gaps between the face frame and the side of the cabinet. Also, the bottom trim was way too thick and had to be sanded flush, therefore exposing lots of end grain. This student here just did not wipe off any of the excess glue when they put on the face frame to the side of the nightstand. It's very hard, very difficult to remove hardened glue from veneer without burning through. Here you can see where the rabbet on the top, when it sits on the top of the sides, it wasn't wide enough, therefore the side is proud of the top. You can't put trim on this. You can see another student had the bottom rail too low, and you can see where the plywood is proud of that bottom rail and will always be. Here you can see a face frame that wasn't designed to be wide enough to cover the sides fully, and now the sides stick out proud of the edge of the stile, and there's nothing you can do about that. It's going to be like that forever. Here the student did such a bad job of using the proper technique. They got different widths. It's not even flush. This is a top of a nightstand, and they're going to burn through that top trying to sand that down. Here again, rabbet's not wide enough on the top to house the full thickness of the side, and it's going to be impossible to put trim on there. This is an example of a face frame that's overhang the side. That's okay. You shouldn't go any much more than this. A flush trim router will flush that off nice and flush to the side. The top is supposed to be 22 inches from left to right. That's how wide it is when you're standing over the top of it from your left hand looking down to your right hand, 22 inches long, if you will, or wide. The top is supposed to be about 16 and 9/16 inches wide, so that it'll be about a 16th inch over the 3/4 inch face frame that's going to be glued and nailed on it later. The depth of the cabinet is around 16 and a half inches deep. Therefore, from the front of the cabinet to the back is about 16 and a half. You want to make sure that your stiles on the face frame are exactly 2 inches wide, as shown in this particular photograph. This is a good job by this particular student. The opening for the drawer is 2.5 from the bottom of the top rail to the top of the mid rail is 2.5 to accommodate a 2-inch wide drawer that will be going in later. And the dado, the top of the dado is going to be 3 inches from the bottom of the side to the top, so that the top of your bottom shelf will be 3 inches from the floor to the top, as shown in this particular photograph.